In case you missed last week's video, we got the floor system for the not so tiny tiny house framed and sheathed, and next we could move on to framing the walls. The first step was to lay out the locations of the walls, starting with the exterior walls. And since the exterior walls will be framed with 2x6s, we marked in 5.5 inches at each end of a wall section, and then snapped a chalk line connecting those two marks. We then repeated this process around the entire perimeter of the building, and then we could mark out the interior wall locations. And the interior walls will be framed with 2x4s since they aren't load-bearing. After marking the wall locations, we could go back and mark out the window and door openings, also writing the size of the rough openings in each opening as well. And I should also mention that we do have plans available for this tiny house, which I'll link to in the video description, and each stud location is actually specifically called out on the framing plan. Since most of the walls will have plywood installed on the interior face, we needed to make sure all of the studs would allow the plywood to break evenly for aesthetics, hence the very specific framing plan. Anyway, after marking out all of the window and door openings, the lumber was delivered, and you'll see that I didn't make the same mistake as in the last video, trying to transport all of these materials with my truck. And I'm happy to say no tailgates were harmed in the making of this video. Next, we got started framing the first wall, first cutting the top and bottom plates to length at 12 feet, and then we can mark layout on the plates.
So we're gonna hook, that's basically flush on your outside of your frame, 2-foot centers. You're gonna basically do a corner. This is a framer's dream come true. Right here, 2-foot centers.
No windows.
12-foot wall, no windows. Oh man. Yep, got your big 12, we call that. Big 12.
Once the layout was marked, we set the plates in place on the floor and then got the studs we needed cut to length.
All right, 91.5, and then we got 4.5 for plates. So 91.5 plus a half is 92, plus 4 is 96.
Confirmed.
Let's write that down. 91, 1/2. This is so I don't inch monster any of these studs and then nail it in a wall and realize I cut one an inch long or an inch short, which doesn't sound like it would happen, but trust me, it happens. I'll just kind of destroy a tape and we're just gonna mark on it. That's our stud. I can just reel it out and not even have to think about it.
Makes sense. Get some dry erase markers, man.
Yeah.
While Ray continued cutting more studs to length, Eric and I started getting the wall framed, first crowning all of the studs, making sure they were crowned in the same direction. After assembling the inside corner, we could get the outside corner put together, which required a few more pieces of lumber to be added. The piece towards the outside of the building would serve as a nailer for the corner trim on the outside of the building, and the piece towards the inside would be a nailer for the wall covering on the inside of the building. And by assembling the pieces in this U-shape, insulation can still be added to this area later. Once the corner was assembled, we added the rest of the studs, and the nailing pattern here was 3 3-inch ring shank nails at each end of each stud. We repeated the same process at the other end of the building with another identical wall, since this tiny house is basically mirrored on both ends, and then we could get the wall tacked in place against the floor of the building. And doing this not only allowed us to straighten the bottom plate of the wall by lining it up with the chalk line we had marked earlier, but it also created a kind of hinge which helped keep the wall in place when we stood it up later.
We'll still do this. Take a sight on it. It looks good.
Next, we squared the wall by pulling some diagonal measurements and making sure those numbers matched, and then Eric added one more nail to tack the wall in this square position so that we could add the sheathing. Before adding the sheathing, we snapped a line 3 feet up from the bottom of the bottom plate, and this would ensure the sheathing would overlap onto the rim joist, which both further weatherproofs the building but also helps tie the walls to the floor.
Ready, drop the hammer.
Next, we attach the sheathing, and you'll notice that Eric and his crew typically run their sheathing horizontally. And the reason for this is it allows the studs to be straightened during the sheathing process. To make sure the studs were straight, Eric marked where each stud should land before attaching the sheathing, and removing any bow from the studs will make fastening the interior wall coverings a lot easier later on. The sheathing we're using, which is Zip R Insulated Sheathing, which the folks at Huber Woods were kind enough to provide, so big shout out to them, has the nailing pattern printed right on the panels, so nailing each piece went super quickly, and just like the floor sheathing, we cross-cut a panel with the track saw to start the second row so that the butt joints were staggered. Also, let's talk about this Zip R Insulated Sheathing for a second because it's a pretty interesting product. So as you might be able to tell, the sheathing has a layer of rigid foam attached to the inside face of the sheathing, and these panels are available with different thicknesses of foam in different R values. Since Asheville is a fairly temperate climate, I went with the R3 panels, which have a 1/2 inch thick layer of foam. And this might not sound like much, but even this thin layer of foam will provide a thermal break between the sheathing and the studs, which will greatly reduce any thermal bridging. And in case you're not familiar with this concept, thermal bridging is when your framing lumber essentially acts as a conduit where heat can be transmitted through your studs out of your house, wasting tons of energy. And Eric actually has a video on the Perkins Builder Brothers channel where he shows this in action using a thermal camera, and if you use this insulated sheathing, this thermal bridging is essentially eliminated because the foam acts as a thermal break. Pretty cool. Anyway, we continued attaching more sheathing until we got to the top row where we needed to rip a panel into strips. And we also made sure to rip these pieces wide enough so they'd overlap the double top plate, which would be added after all of the walls were stood up. After attaching the strip, we could get all the seams on this zip sheathing taped, which is essential to making this sheathing system waterproof. Before taping, we blew off any sawdust, which would keep the tape from sticking as well, and then we started taping, working our way up from the bottom of the wall. After adding the tape, we then rolled it using a pressure roller, which we mounted on this extension pole just to make it a little easier to roll. And rolling the tape helps to activate the pressure-sensitive adhesive on this tape and is a required step to get the 30-year warranty that goes along with this zip sheathing. When taping these seams, the tape needed to overlap in the same way as shingles would, with the tape higher on the wall overlapping the lower tape. And to accomplish this, we just worked our way up the wall until we got to the topmost seams, rolling the tape as we went. We repeated the entire sheathing process on the other wall we had framed, and then we could get the walls stood up. Before staining the walls, we attached some temporary bracing so that we could lock the walls in place once they were upright and plumb. Staining the wall was easy enough with the three of us, and you can see that those hinge nails we added earlier kept the wall from sliding off the edge of the floor when lifting it. Once the wall was upright, Eric added a screw to tack it in place and then added another block to the floor where we could attach the cross bracing on that end. We got the wall plumb before attaching the bracing, and once the wall was braced plumb, we attached the bottom plate to the floor with more nails, making sure the nails went into the rim joist below. We also nailed that overlapping sheathing to the rim joist, which again helped tie the walls to the floor. While we frame more wall sections, let's talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Policy Genius. Policy Genius is America's leading online insurance marketplace and makes comparing your existing policy against others super easy, ensuring you get the best possible price. In fact, Policy Genius has saved their home and auto insurance customers an average of $1,000 per year, and revisiting your home and auto policies can be an easy win to start the year off right. The process is simple, and after answering a few quick questions online about you and your property, if the Policy Genius experts find you a better rate, they'll get you switched for free. If you own a car, Policy Genius can also compare your home and auto policies across different insurers and even mix and match them to maximize your savings. So if you're interested in saving money on your home, auto, or life insurance policies, because honestly, who isn't, visit policygenius.com/craftedworkshop to shop the market and compare quotes. And big thanks again to Policy Genius for sponsoring this week's video. Once those walls were stood up, we finally got to a wall with a window opening. And in case you've never framed a window opening, they can be framed in a few fairly simple ways, but they can be a little confusing the first few times you do it. The thing that helped me wrap my head around the process was thinking about which parts were supported by the other pieces of the framing. For instance, the cripples need to support the windowsill, so you'll need a cripple at each end of the sill, as well as cripples wherever there would have been studs if there wasn't a window opening there. And these cripples are not only for support, but also act as a nailing surface for the interior wall covering, which again will be plywood in my case. The other main component of a door or window opening is the header, which is supported by the jack studs. And because of this, you need the header to be 3 inches wider than the rough opening so that it can be supported by the jacks. Speaking of the header, Eric recommended using this box header so that we could add insulation inside the header later. And I've never seen this type of header in use, but building it this way will allow me to sandwich about 2.5 inches of foam insulation in the header where there typically would be none. Once the end wall was framed, we partially sheathed it and got it stood up, and then we could attach that end wall to the 2 side walls to tie everything together. We came back and added the rest of the sheathing and got the seams taped, and then we attempted to cut out the excess sheathing from the window opening, but had to put that on hold since the reciprocating saw blade we had wasn't quite long enough. We repeated the process at the other end of the building, and I also worked on laying out the big center wall, which has a whopping 5 window openings. I of course screwed this up at some point along the way, so we had to flip the plates and lay everything out again, but thankfully Eric knew what he was doing and we got it right the second time. So we started to get this big wall framed, but thankfully we ran out of time and didn't get it stood up, as it just so happened that a tropical storm moved through Asheville the following day, and that 24-foot long wall probably would have blown over if it wasn't really solidly braced.
Crazy windy back here, but I'm happy to say that all of our walls are still standing very nicely, which is awesome. Very leafy and pine needly around here, so we have to do a little cleanup work before we really get to it today. Really happy that we got the 3 walls on each end up, so that way they were kind of braced against each other. Definitely better than having them just flying out by themselves in the wind.
After getting things cleaned up, we finished framing the wall, which was really just more of the same except for the bit of added framing where one of the interior walls would meet up with this exterior wall. We got the wall squared up and sheathed, and we also wised up and went ahead and cut out the window openings while the wall was on the ground, since that's a lot easier than trying to do it on a ladder. To cut the opening, we used a router with a flush trim bit, and this made really quick work of the process and left us with a super clean cut. The only downside is that this foam insulation dust is extremely itchy, and I had some pretty itchy forearms for the rest of the day.
Boom!
Anyway, once the wall was framed and sheathed, it was time for a pretty big moment, standing up this 24-foot long wall section, and I pulled out the drone to try and capture just how big this wall was.
1, 2, 3, waist. All right, shoulder. 1, 2, 3, shoulder. All right, walk her on up.
Thankfully, with all 4 of us, it was actually pretty easy to stand up, and once it was upright, we made sure to add plenty of cross bracing, since this wall was unsupported until the walls that divide the building into its separate rooms were framed later. The last exterior wall to frame was the front wall on the center section of the house, and this is where that huge 16-foot wide sliding door will be located. And rather than try to build this wall as one long section, we framed it in 2 halves, since the majority of the bottom plate would have been cut away anyway. For this giant opening, we used triple layered LVLs as the header, which I'll show in a bit, but we also used triple layered jack studs at each end of this door opening to provide ample support for that big header. We repeated the process at the other end of the wall, which also has an opening for an entry door, which will be the main entry point for the house since the large sliding doors lock from the inside. We also went ahead and partially sheathed this wall, and we had to notch the sheathing around those proud joists so that it could lap onto the rim joist blocking below.
Oh, you gotta take that screw out over there, yeah.
We got that wall section stood up and fastened in place, and then it was time to assemble that enormous header. So again, we used 3 layers of these 9.5 inch wide by 1 3/4 inch thick LVL beams for the header here, which was kind of overkill, but should definitely keep the header from deflecting and sagging over time. We assembled the header in place rather than trying to lift it into place pre-assembled, and this made things a lot easier. We also added a backstop on the front of the wall to keep the LVLs from falling off the front of the wall while assembling it. To assemble the header, we nailed the layers together using more 3-inch ring shank nails and added a row of nails roughly every 12 inches. After assembling the header, we added some pieces of blocking to the top of the header, which basically act as cripples where the rafters will land above this header, and then finally we added the top plate across the header to finish up the framing. That pretty much wrapped up the exterior wall framing, and the following day most of the Perkins crew were on hand to get the roof framed, but first we needed to finish getting the interior partition walls framed so that we could get the double top plates added. Jamie and I worked on getting one of those walls framed, and we started by getting the layout marked on both plates. Before actually framing the wall, we got the ever-present leaves moved out of the way so we'd end up with a flat wall, and then we got to framing, starting with assembling one of the L-shaped sections where the 2 interior walls would intersect. After framing that half of the wall, we worked on framing the door opening, and we added a piece of sheathing between the jack studs on both sides of the opening so that the door would be centered in this hallway section. We also ripped down a 2x6 to use as the header here rather than using a 2x4, and this was to keep from having to add some tiny cripples above the header. With that, the wall was framed, so we got it stood up and attached to the adjoining walls, making sure all of the walls were plumb while we were at it. And the front wall was simple since it was already braced by the other walls, but the two walls at the back of the house needed a little bit of tweaking to get them plumb. Thankfully, we had about a dozen sets of hands on site that day, so this was pretty easy, and once we got everything locked together nice and plumb, we could come back and get all of the double top plates added. In case you're not familiar, these double top plates span across two adjoining wall sections and help to attach them more securely. Double top plates also help carry the load of a rafter when it lands between studs, and we technically didn't even need them here since all of our rafters line up with a stud or a header. Anyway, we repeated the process on the other interior partition wall, and then we could move on to roof framing, which I'll cover in next week's video.
Alright guys, hopefully you enjoyed this one. Obviously getting the walls framed was a huge step in this process, and in next week's video we're going to be getting the roof framed and sheathed and getting this building dried in. And this was really the last thing we got done before my wife and I had our second kid, and it was a bit of a mad dash, so as you'll see I had some help in the form of most of the Perkins Builder Brothers crew on hand for the roof build, and it was a lot of fun working with all those guys. So if you want to make sure not to miss next week's video, go ahead and get subscribed and ring that little notification bell. Also, I want to say a huge shout out to all of my supporters on Patreon and my YouTube members. I really appreciate all of the funding you guys give me to help continue doing projects like this. All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one, and until next week, happy building.